And we'll move on to our final speaker of this morning, who is Anastasia Crickley. So Anastasia has worked extensively as a community worker and educator.
That's enough about me. That'll do. That'll do.
Do you not want any more? Because I've got somebody sent me a book to read out on you.
No, don't. That's enough of that.
Okay, look, I'll let her introduce herself.
Okay. And look, can I decided to put up a few thoughts on slides, not my normal procedure as everybody around here knows. But I think we're really called at the moment, and I think what Eileen's achievement and what Ruben has said illustrate this very clearly. We're called to think about what we mean when we're traversing that road as community workers from the real to the ideal, because that is the community work journey. So I think we're called to realize that it's not just good intentions are simply not good enough in that journey. And I think with regard to racism, we need to see ourselves as either realizing or restricting rights. And at the moment, to quote Martin Sandbo, that Norwegian who's written a book recently, we have an opportunity to either create the conditions for some sort of an economy of belonging. Now, I think he's wrong, because actually there never really was an economy of belonging. There was an economy where some people felt they belonged, and where a lot of other people, including people experiencing racism here traditionally, knew they didn't belong. But we have an opportunity to face some sort of a new deal within which people might belong, within which we might be able to address racism, or a possibility to promote and invoke fascism. And that's exactly what happened the last time the world faced a major crisis. And the last real time the world faced a major crisis of the nature of the one that we now face was after the Great Depression in the 1930s. And both of those things happened. In the USA, there was a New Deal of sorts, and in Europe, we faced fascism leading to the Second World War. My starting point in talking about racism is to describe it as a toxic global discourse which divides, marginalizes, and legitimates hatred. It doesn't just create it, it also legitimates it. And indeed, the people who speak volubly about racism, both in this country, as they stand outside courthouses trying to do this and that, and in the USA, including the president of the USA, do legitimate hatred. I suggest to you that there are challenges of non-optional issues that we need to take on. And the other thing we need to do is to reframe the agenda and reframe our language at all levels. And I think that language maybe needs a bit of interrogation. Even listening to the sorts of things we've been saying already this morning, I think it does need a bit of interrogation. We also need to consider the integrated intersectional responses that are required. It does make a difference if people experience racism as a woman, but racism is not the same as the oppression of women. It does make a difference if people experience racism as a person with disabilities, but it's not the same as the oppression of people with disabilities. But we need to do that also in a multicultural Ireland, which it is, but a multicultural Ireland of citizens and residents. And this constant referring to residents, I'd suggest to you, is neither helpful nor useful, or the constant referral to citizens is neither helpful nor useful, and successfully excludes the most marginalized people, a number of whom experience racism on a daily basis. In starting there, we need to think also, in my view, about rights. We need to think about moving from the constant narrative that community workers invoke about assessing local needs. I mean, we need to get beyond that in a hurry. Local needs are easily enough identified. Usually they're a very good way of starting where the people are at and successfully keeping them there ad nauseum. But if we begin to look to rights and interests, then we can look to rights holders and duty bearers. Whose job is it to make sure that people's rights are realized? And how do we actually make sure? States have agreed to guaranteed rights, including ours, but the question that we have to ask is then whether they do or not, and quite clearly they don't. In having this discussion about racial discrimination and racism this morning, though, I think it is useful for us to look back at what we have agreed, what our country has agreed will be our way of addressing racism. So having ratified the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, we agreed that racism is a preference or an exclusion based on race, colour, descent, national or ethnic origin. And remembering that this was written in the 1960s, one can also maybe excuse to some extent some of the language, also written by men, I might say, which has the purpose or the effect, and that's the bit for me that's really important, has the purpose or the effect, which means it doesn't matter whether you meant it or not. It kind of the purpose or the effect of denying or impairing human rights or fundamental political, economic, social or cultural freedoms. So therefore, you know, we're looking at something that can happen at an individual level or can happen at a level. Now, one of the issues that has emerged over the last while is this return to some discussion about hierarchies of oppression. And as Eileen said very correctly, racism is racism. There can be no hierarchies of oppression. All they do is serve the needs of the powerful. But there are legacies of slavery and colonialism, which in particular have affected people of African descent and also indigenous peoples. There is, however, continued discrimination against Roma and travellers, and a very explicit form of anti-traveller racism, which blames travellers and blames Roma for the discrimination that they experience. But as well as that, one would have to acknowledge that one of the main current focuses of racism is on those who are perceived to be Muslim. In fact, if you look at what's happened in the last while during the pandemic, you would say that in particular migrant workers globally have experienced racism. In Ireland, on the basis of, if you look at what happened in the meat factories and the way in which the owners of the meat factories have successfully wormed their way out of the responsibility that they should be forced to have for it. And congratulations to MRCI on the reporting of their inputs to the Dáil committee last week in that regard. But racism is also a social myth. Which involves, there's no such thing as race, but there are racialization processes. And if you look at what happened to those of us who are Irish in 19th century Ireland, we moved from being idiots at the start of the 19th century to people with apes' faces by the end of the 19th century. These demonized groups justify oppression and in effect create action, because racism is not just about attitudes, it is also about actions. But I'm interested also when we come to addressing it, that we need to distinguish between structures or symbols of success and real success. The fact that as a community worker, there are now 10 people from different communities involved with whatever work you're involved in may be a bit of a symbol of success, but I think there are a lot of other questions to be asked way beyond that. We need to look beyond the structures of intersection and the way things link together to the way power works in the deployment of identity, how that's perceived by people, how people feel about their identity as a consequence of the way that they're disempowered, including by community work and community workers. We need to distinguish, as travellers would tell you here and wasn't done for a number of years, between ethnicity and nationality, because they're not the same. And very particularly as community workers, both for this and for a variety of other issues, I think we need to stop this rubbish about vulnerable groups. People are made vulnerable. We're not born vulnerable, any of us. I'm not vulnerable because I'm a woman. Nobody else is vulnerable because they're travellers or because they're Black people or because they're suffering racism. They have been made vulnerable as a consequence of the experience. And of course, in doing all of that, I'm suggesting that we need to consider women and the particular position of women. In Ireland and elsewhere, racism is addressed through national laws and policies. Now, let's be honest, we got national laws on racism in Ireland because we had to comply with EU directives. So, but we do have anti-racist laws to comply with EU directives. We also are supposed to meet our international human rights law obligations. For example, see the CER, the Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination Review of Ireland in 2019. And we also need, as a state, to respond to the Council of Europe Commission on Racism and Intolerance and the Framework Convention on the Protection of National Minorities. So, you know, we we have a sort of a framework within which racism legally could be addressed. There are gaps, and I know one of the things Eileen has spoken about quite rightly is the need for hate crime legislation, and the need for measures also to address hate speech. One of the things that happened recently, which has already been alluded to, has been the setting up of the Anti-Racism Committee. This was announced at CERD in Geneva in December 2019, and Caroline Fennell of UCC was announced to be the chair of it there. 15 members, sorry, that should read, were appointed by David Stanton in June 2015. 8 would have current experiences of racism, and this includes 2 travellers. All were, and the rest are from IBEC, ICTU, and from other organisations. I'm a member of it, as is, for example, Shane O'Curry from the Irish Network Against Racism. The brief is to produce a draft anti-racism strategy in a year. I think it's an interesting brief, and it'll be interesting to see what happens. There is quite a deal of controversy, which I'm sure some of you are aware about, with regard to the committee, because some people would feel that the groups experiencing racism and the groups that represent groups experiencing racism should have been invited to nominate, but that is not the system that was used. And there's also some concern about some of the people who were appointed by the Minister of the day. But the questions that I'd like to finish with then are asking, what sort of world, what sort of Ireland for the future do you want to create, or do you want to be part of creating as a community worker? And I'm suggesting to you that there are a couple of things about that. We need to go beyond the old certainties and cemented identities and exclusions. For example, this notion of integration. I mean, integrating into what? Do you mean trying to integrate into something that's already there, which is already powerful and controlled? Or do you mean trying to create something new? Do you want to link where we've come from with where we are and where we want to go? And from that point of view, then I just want to raise 3 questions at the end, and to say the things we need to consider, and I don't know if we've time to discuss them now, is who do community workers work with? Who do you work with, and why do you work with them? How do you work with them, and why do you choose to work with them? What do you need to stop doing, and why, if you're to be part of the difference rather than part of the difficulty about racism? And what do you need to start doing, and why, if you're to be part of the difference rather than part of the difficulty about racism? I'm suggesting that none of us are neutral, and that we either are part of the difference or part of the difficulty. We either are fellow travellers cementing the status quo, or fellow travellers with Eileen and Ruben and others who are trying to widen the cracks that have begun to emerge in it. And I'm finally suggesting that we have a limited window of opportunity within which to do that, and we need to employ all our resources and all of our thinking into creating the conditions for a society here and the conditions elsewhere which can create justice and equality and rights for all the human beings that are part of them. Thanks.
Stacia, out of my own learning, and probably not, I don't know, everyone here is community development workers, but out of my own learning, and I know I probably should already know this, but I'd rather ask the question than never know the answer. What do you know the way, like you say, people become vulnerable, right? And
Yeah.
or marginalised, or so if you wanted to use the term, just for myself going forward in the future, if you wanted to use the term vulnerable people, or people on the edges of society or marginalised, what would you use?
I use the term marginalised all the time, Eileen, because that infers that someone pushed you out. I don't use disadvantage because it's like it fell out of the sky on top of you. I use minority because it's purely descriptive. But I avoid using the term vulnerable because I feel that it creates a charity mentality, you know, that poor vulnerable person sitting begging on the street, let me feel better after giving them a few shillings or something like that. So I would say marginalised, because I think it's an active verb. It says you're pushed out. And I think it's very true of what's happened to travellers. Travellers have been marginalised.
No, I just wanted to know for language going forward. Thank you.
You're very welcome, and you're dead right that language is important as well. I mean, if someone else tells me they're helping people, I will positively scream, you know. They're mostly helping themselves.